Hello, interwebs, and welcome back to Russell's Guide to Monsters, where today we're going to look at snake people. Much like fish people and bird people, there are many variations of this concept, and some very similar creatures go by different names, while other vastly different creatures use the same name, and it all depends on the setting. I haven't made an exhaustive list, but in my personal experience, snake people tend to go by one of about half a dozen common names. First up, we have snake men, serpent folk, or some other similar variation thereof. Next, there's Ophidians, which is basically the same thing but in Greek, where ophis means snake, although the name isn't terribly common. Sticking with Greek, there's also Lamia, named after a character from classical mythology. I've already covered her in greater depth in episode 3, and I don't want to repeat everything here, but just to summarize, in the original Greek versions, she was just a nondescript monster, and her first solid connection to serpents didn't come about until John Keats' loose retelling of her story in the early 19th century. The other creature of Greek mythology lending her name to snake people is Medusa. Due to being the most famous example of a snake-haired person, her name has become a byword for the entire group, similar to how any winged horse will almost inevitably be called a Pegasus. Like mother like son, I suppose. In some settings, such as Dungeons & Dragons, the usage of Medusa to refer to the entire race/species is officially canon, while in others the group as a whole is called Gorgons. The latter is closer to the original myth, in which Medusa is the proper name of one specific Gorgon, but that being said, the original myths made no mention of a serpentine lower body. Much like Lamia, this snaky tale was an addition by a much later artist, in this case Ray Harryhausen and his iconic work on Clash of the Titans. Lastly, we travel further afield to India, from whence we get the name Naga. Much like Ophidian, Naga simply comes from the Sanskrit word for snake. In my urban fantasy setting, Ophidian is the more scientific name for a member of the snake-like humanoid species, but the politically correct term is Naga. Using the wrong term for the circumstance can land someone in hot water, despite the fact that both names have the same root meaning and refer to the same group of people. But hey, that's political correctness for you. Also, perhaps it's because their namesakes were both women, but when you see creatures in fiction called Medusa or Lamia, they're almost always female. And yes, they have boobs. Naga, however, is a male-gendered noun. The female version is Nagi or Nagini. How you pluralize these names is also a matter of debate, owing to their foreign origins, although I would argue that if it's the name of a fictional race in an English-language setting, the correct plural should simply be Medusas, Lamias, or Nagas. It's octopuses all over again. There are also still other names, obviously, but these tend to be unique to their specific setting. Regardless of what you call them, they're all some combination of snakes and humanoid people, so for the rest of this video, I'm just going to use the name Sneeple as a generic catch-all term. Of course, names aren't the only things that vary between settings. The exact physiology fluctuates wildly as well, but I believe that in general, these serpentine humanoids tend to have a more humanoid head end and a more snake-like tail end, although obviously there are exceptions to this, too, and what goes on in the middle isn't set in stone either. In some cases, there's nothing extra special in the middle to speak of, just the body of a snake. One such case of a snake with a humanoid head is the Noreone of Japanese folklore. Her name literally means wet woman due to the fact that she is usually seen washing her hair, and as such is always found by lakes or seas. According to a 19th century source, her tail is 3 cho in length, or nearly 330 meters, although I suspect this description refers to her entire body below the neck, not just her actual tail. On that note, some people may try to tell you that snakes are just tails with faces, but to this I reply that someone has clearly never heard the phrase snout-to-vent measurement. The nominal vent in this term is the cloaca, and it marks where the torso ends. Thus, the snout-to-vent length is the distance from the face to the start of the tail, and snakes actually have fairly short tails. They just have really long bodies to make up for it. Another humanoid-headed serpent with noteworthy hair is Glykon, who had a face like a man and long blonde tresses. This character was the central figure of a Roman fertility cult, which flourished during the 2nd century AD, and he also seems to have been central to some period drama if we read between the lines. Most of the surviving documentation we have about Glykon and his cult comes from the satirist Lucian, who tells us that the entity was created by the Greek mystic Alexander of Abonotikos. Considered to be a prophet by some, but a false prophet by Lucian, Alexander claimed that Glykon was the latest incarnation of Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine, who was also associated with snakes, which, incidentally, is why the snake wrapped around a staff is a modern medical symbol. Lucian, meanwhile, decried the entire enterprise was a hoax and claimed that Glykon was nothing more than a hand puppet in a blonde wig, which is hysterical. Nevertheless, Glykon's cult still enjoyed an era of considerable popularity, even garnering the patronage of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius and, much later, noted comic book writer Alan Moore. It's likely that at least some of this social influence came not from snake tails, but from coat tails, specifically riding them by leveraging the serpent iconography of pre-existing fertility cults. Women attempting to conceive a child would turn to Glykon for his divine blessing, but according to Lucian, Alexander had a less spiritual means of producing pregnancy amongst his followers. The Nagas of Indian and Southeast Asian mythology also have connections to fertility, depending on location, although this connection is frequently tied to their association with rivers and other bodies of water. Like many other Sneeple in pop culture, Nagas of Hindu mythology are both venomous and powerful, but unlike many typical examples, they are also usually benevolent. What form they take can vary anywhere from a normal human adorned with snakes to entirely snake-like, although they often fall somewhere in between the two. When they appear as snakes with humanoid heads, they most closely resemble the creatures of the same name from Dungeons & Dragons. Rather than have a distinctly human head on a snake's body, like the Nore-Onna, D&D's Nagas have a head which is fully reptilian while still possessing humanoid features. They also aren't the only Sneeple in D&D. Far from it. The setting has had to create its own superfamily of the various Sneeple races called the Serpent Folk, and it all started with the Saruk, who created the other scaled races. Just the Serpent Folk alone include Nagas, which have no arms, Meriliths, which are heavily armed, Salamanders, which have arms and literal firepower, and Coatls, which have wings in lieu of arms. Ophidians sometimes have legs as well, but they haven't always, and in an ironic twist, their Medusas have legs instead of a tail, although they aren't technically Serpent Folk. The only other true serpent folk are the were-serpents, which can go back and forth between forms like a werewolf, and Yuan-Ti, which are such a large topic that we'll discuss them more later on in this video. Other non-serpent folk Sneeple in D&D include the Lelendi, which have arms and wings, and Lamia nobles, but not regular Lamia, which has a leonine body and is thus closer to the original myth. Returning quickly to Nagas, they also appear in World of Warcraft, sporting some pretty nifty frills, although in this setting they also have a humanoid torso and arms in between the humanoid head and serpentine lower body. This morphological layout is probably the most popular way of depicting Sneeple in modern pop culture, and you can easily see why. The serpentine lower body and tail pretty firmly establish the snake connection, while the humanoid upper body, and more importantly arms, allow the character to hold and manipulate objects. It also gives you a convenient space to show off some boobs. Usually the objects being held are weapons, because Sneeple are frequently villainous or at least antagonistic, due to snakes already having a bad reputation in Western culture. Whether the head is more humanoid or snake-like doesn't really matter as much with this style, since the torso and arms are now bringing much of the humanness to the picture. Another interesting point about the anatomy of these creatures is how much of the snake's body they have. As I mentioned earlier regarding the Nore-Onna, snakes' actual tails are fairly short. That would make these Sneeple the serpentine equivalent of centaurs, since they seem to be human or humanoid from the waist up, but a snake from the neck down. Given that centaurs with donkey bodies are typically called Ono-centaurs, and those with lion bodies are Leo-centaurs, it may be most appropriate to call these Sneeple Ophio-centaurs. Now, one aspect of Ophio-centaurs which I find especially peculiar, and one which can vary quite a bit between settings, is how many limbs they have. Most humans only have 4, 2 arms and 2 legs, although obviously there are exceptions to this. Snakes, meanwhile, have no external limbs, again barring the rare exception. Bearing this in mind, you would expect Sneeple individuals to have some number of limbs between 0 and 4, and probably an even one at that, because nature tends to prefer bilateral symmetry for such things. In some cases you'd be correct, but in other settings not so much. Just as you find examples of Sneeple which have no limbs, it's also not uncommon to find variants with more than 4, with some of the best-known examples being the Meriliths found in Dungeons & Dragons, Final Fantasy, and elsewhere. These Sneeple, both the Meriliths specifically and other many-armed variants in general, are more likely than their less well-armed cousins to take inspiration from Indian and Vedic mythology, where there is a tendency in artwork to represent powerful beings such as deities with multiple sets of arms. Insert your own right-to-bear-arms pun here. In an ironic twist, however, traditional Hindu Nagas are usually only depicted with 2 arms, or none at all, and it's more common to see them depicted with multiple heads instead. For a long time now, I've thought this physiological layout is kind of silly, and to be honest, I still do, but if you just take away 1 pair of arms, leaving them with 4 like the female Nagas from WoW, it actually becomes shockingly coherent. At that point, a Merilith would have a head, a torso with 2 pairs of limbs, and a tail. While some of the features may be vestigial in certain species, that's still the fundamental body plan for basically every tetrapod on Earth. Perhaps the lower set of arms is actually a pair of legs, but ones where the feet have evolved a degree of manual dexterity like those of an orangutan. It's a theory at any rate. I also find myself wondering about their curious blend of reptilian and mammalian features. In classical mythology, the Gorgons, like Medusa, were ostensibly mammals with serpentine, i.e. reptilian, hair, but most other Sneeple, like the Nore-Onna and Glycon, are nominal reptiles with mammalian hair. And boobs. This just raises further biological questions. Just as Sneeple of Southeast Asian mythology can be found with multiple heads, and Sneeple inspired by said mythology might possess multiple pairs of arms, multiple tails aren't out of the question either. We've discussed the bicaudal Melusina once before already in the Mermaids video, because you probably know her better as the Starbucks mermaid. As I also mentioned in that video, however, she's not always a mermaid. Sometimes she's a bit more draconic, and other times she's more serpentine. Unfortunately, for the sake of this example, she usually has only one tail when it's more serpentine than piscine, but I'm also hesitant to say she never had two snake tails, because her anatomy is always changing, sometimes giving her feathered or bat-like wings as well. That being said, she's still got nothing on Greek mythology's most serpentine power couple, Echidna and Typhon. Starting with the missus, she's been described in various, sometimes conflicting ways throughout the ages, but just about every account agrees she was partly humanoid and partly snake. According to the Orphic tradition, her overall anatomy is most similar to that of the Noreona, with the head of a beautiful, long-haired woman on the body of a serpent from the neck down, but in Hesiod's Theogony, she's much closer to the standard modern Naga look. In it, she's half nymph with glancing eyes and fair cheeks, and boobs, and half again a huge snake, great and awful, with speckled skin. Hesiod also claimed that she was a man-eater. Watch out, boy, she'll chew you up. And this association of anthropophagy with her serpentine half may suggest that it was not a snake's tail she possessed, but rather its cephalic end. This would give her a head at each end, one beautiful and one terrible. How poetic. Piero Ligorio's 1555 sculpture is probably the most famous visual depiction we have of her, and it gives her a single head and two tails rather than the other way around. Aristophanes, however, upped the ante from Hesiod and said she had 100 heads, presumably those of snakes, and presumably to match her husband, because apparently the two are one of those couples that coordinate their looks. Now, Typhon's descriptions are even more varied and motley than those of his pernicious paramour, but once again, according to Hesiod and his Theogony, Typhon the Terrible was almost unimaginably powerful, and he had the heads of 100 serpents sprouting from his shoulders. Some artists have interpreted this to mean that he had 100 snake heads, akin to how you might say that someone has a good head on their shoulders, while others have treated the snakes like 50 pairs of arms instead. These many heads uttered every kind of sound unspeakable, from snake-like hissing to a bull's bellow and a lion's roar to the language of the gods themselves. This, I'm sure, must create a Typhonian antiphony, and I only mention it because Typhonian and antiphony are perfect anagrams of one another. Aeschylus said that these heads could also breathe fire, but Apollodorus said the fire flashed from his eyes, and that Typhon was a huge winged monster humanoid from the waist up, but with snake-like coils for limbs. In his own words, one of his hands reached out to the west and the other to the east, and from them projected 100 dragons' heads. From his thighs downward, he had huge coils of vipers, which, when drawn out, reached to his very head and emitted a loud hissing. Nonnus of Panopolis also described Typhon as possessing snaky legs, and perhaps these are what inspired Ligorio's statue. The condition of having entire snakes and not just the tail in place of legs actually has a name, anguipedalism, because Typhon's not the only one to have it. Now, a statement like that begs the obvious question, who else has it? We already know that it's not Medusa. She has relatively normal human legs when she's not a centaur, and Lamia was a quadruped, or perhaps a shark. Well, take a firm grip on your socks, lest they be blown off, because the group of monsters from Greek mythology that had snakes in place of legs was the giants. That's right, the creatures which you might most expect to merely resemble scaled-up humans, no pun intended, were the ones with the serpentine lower bodies. Admittedly, the early depictions did resemble huge hoplites, and later editions of anguipedalism is believed by some to have taken inspiration from Typhon's fascinating physiology. Probably the best anguipedal example, however, is the divine figure Abraxas, who had the head of a rooster on the upper body of a man, in addition to the snakes for legs. This calls to mind the cockatrice, said to be born of a cockerel's egg incubated by a snake, but crossed with a human. The ancient Scythians also worshipped a snake-legged goddess, known amongst modern scholars as the snake-legged goddess. On the other side of the Bosporus, ancient Athens gives us not one but two different examples of mytho-historical anguipeds, both of whom feature in Athens' creation myth. The first was Cecrops I, who allegedly founded Athens and served as its first king. According to the story, he was a Tokthanes, born from the earth itself, which may be reflected in the fact that his lower body is that of a serpent, the creature which is physically and metaphorically closest to the ground. His dual nature may also reflect his dual status as both a Greek citizen and a barbarian, making him both man and beast, a rationalization proposed by Diodorus of Sicily. The second snake-legged character is the fourth king of Athens and Cecrops' grandson Erecthonius, sometimes conflated with Erechtheus in early works. Well, I say he was Cecrops' grandson. Really, he was the adopted son of Cecrops' 3 daughters, and his conception was strange. You see, Athena went to Hephaestus, the smith god, to commission some new weapons, because he was basically the Hiram Maxim of the Greek pantheon, but the randy handyman was overcome with lust. He tried to have sex with Athena, but missed, and when some of his semen landed on the earth, it grew up to be baby Erecthonius. Athena then put the baby in a box and gave it to Cecrops' daughters to raise, but they were fatally startled by his appearance when they saw that he had snakes in place of legs. When he grew up, he deposed the usurper Amphictyon, becoming king, then founded the Panathenaic festival to honor his not-actually mother, and built a Zoanon of her on the Acropolis. He also built the first quadriga, or four-horse-pulled chariot, to better get about and thereby overcome his lack of functional legs. This makes him a handicapped inventor, and thus he followed in his father's faltering footsteps. His serpentine nature is further reflected by his representation as a snake guarded by Athena's shield in the famous Parthenon statue. Anyway, Athenian anguipeds aside, another possibly snake-legged character from Greek mythology is Boreas, god of the cold north wind. Sometimes the anthropomorphic winds are depicted as exhaling clouds, and although Boreas was frequently shown as an old man with winged human feet, Pausanias wrote that he had snake legs instead. In his natural history, Pliny the Elder cites Megasthenes as telling of a nomadic tribe in India known as the Sciritae, which allegedly had no noses, only nostrils or slits like snakes, and bandy serpentine legs. There was also an unrelated tribe known as the Ophiogenes, or serpent-born, because their ancestor was conceived when a serpentine dragon impregnated the maiden Halia, and they could supposedly cure venomous snake bites with just a touch. Now, Echidna may claim the epithet Mother of Monsters, but the Aztec goddess Coatlicue was Mother Nature incarnate, although she was no less nightmarish. Her name means skirt of snakes, because you'll never guess what she goes around wearing, and in addition to this eponymous garment, she also wears a garland of severed human hands, skulls, and disembodied hearts, making her possibly the most metal take on the Mother Nature concept that any culture has to offer. Unlike most other entries in this video, she doesn't have a human head on a snake body. Quite the opposite. She has a human, or mostly humanoid body, and two snakes for a head. The lone surviving visual depiction we have of her shows these snakes as snoot to snoot, with their mouths forming one mouth, and their right and left eyes forming her pair of eyes. That's the kind of badass nonsense fantasy monster design I spend sleepless nights chasing. Like nearly all female Sneeple, she too has boobs, although hers are specifically saggy due to her pregnancy. In at least one version of Aztec mythology, one of her many, many children is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. FYI, Coatl is just the Nahuatl word for snake, which is where the Coatls in D&D get their name, as well as their feathered wings. And speaking of D&D, I've even homebrewed a cleric of Coatlicue for my custom campaign, and she's a Yuan-Ti. What is a Yuan-Ti, you may be wondering? That's a good question, because I legitimately can't think of any group of Sneeple with more morphological variations than them. They've got purebloods, half-bloods, and abominations, as well as anathemas, ignans, mage-slayers, and holy guardians, and the half-bloods themselves can take many different forms, including the subgroups of mind whisperers, nightmare speakers, and pit masters. To start off with, let's look at the purebloods. These Sneeple are undeniably closer to the people end of that term than the snake end, and they are mostly humanoid in appearance with just a few reptilian tells, such as slit pupils, a forked tongue, or scaly patches of skin. Meanwhile, the half-bloods, also known as malazans, are about half and half, as the former name would imply. They might have the classic tail in place of legs look going on, or they might have a four-limbed humanoid body, but a snake-like head or a cobra's hood. They might also have an entire full-body covering of scales. The half-blood subgroup called nightmare speakers are malazans, which are always of the Ophiocentaur form, or perhaps I should say Ophiocentauridae, because they're also always female. So yes, they all have boobs. At least they're on the mammalian half. The pitmasters are more Typhonian in form, with many writhing serpentine bodies in place of arms, and the mind whisperers are Ophiocephalic, that is to say, they have the head of a snake on a humanoid body. The last major Yuan-Ti variant is the Abominations, which are basically the polar opposite of the purebloods. Rather than being highly humanoid snake people with just a few serpentine features, they are mostly snake-like with just a few humanoid features, such as arms or a humanoid head, like Glycon. Although there is no anguipedal Yuan-Ti variant, at least as far as I'm aware, some malazans do have snakes in place of arms, which I guess you could call anguibrachial, and yes, that is a term which I just made up. Does that physiology make any sense whatsoever? No, of course not, but it's so blatant with its disregard for sensible anatomy that I am 100% here for its bullshit. Regardless, there is practically a Yuan-Ti variant for every major type of Sneeple morphology. Snake with a human head, human with a snake head, person with snake's lower bodies in place of limbs, person with snake's upper bodies in place of limbs, snake with a human middle, human with a snake middle, or at least patches of snakes scattered around the place. Regarding that last combination, one Sneeple-adjacent character which I find myself unusually fascinated by is Celeste from the anime Kimono Michi, aka Animal Mask. Technically, she's a half-lizard humanoid, not a snake person, and the shape of her ventral scales supports this classification. But I want to mention her here anyway, because while most human-animal hybrids have animal appendages like heads, legs, wings, or tails on a human core, her only animal part is her scaly lower torso. I don't think I've ever seen another chimeral beast person that is only bestial in the middle. Plus, if you are going to be a professional wrestler and have only one part of your body be reptilian or snake-like, the core is a pretty good option. The world's most chiseled washboard abs have nothing on the midsection of a constrictor, and you need a powerful core to be a wrestler. I think what gives rise to so much variance among Sneeple in general is the fact that snakes have an elongated, limbless body, so one can either replace humanoid anatomy with the corresponding snake parts, or limbs can be replaced with entire snakes. What's more, lots and lots of cultures all around the world have contact with snakes, so just like how almost everybody has their own local mermaid and winged humanoid variants, they've also got snake people to go with their fish people and bird people. C'est l'homme de serpent. On that mythological musing, I'll call this video to an end, but don't worry, Russell's Guide to Monsters will return shortly, because I've got more to say about snake tales. Until then, though, thanks for watching, and have a happy Halloween. And stop putting boobs on reptiles.